All right, we have just gone live on this latest United in Hope and Healing webinar. And I see many of you are joining now, so that's awesome. Please feel free to tell us where you're from. We love seeing,
in the chat screen.
Yeah, in the chat screen. We love seeing that you're really from all over the world. It's always fun to see where you're all calling in from, and all over the North America. That's really wonderful too. Now, our guest this week is Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, and he is an emergency medicine specialist, a trauma specialist. And so he's around death more often than most doctors, probably. And you may recall the story we told in August 20th when Jeff Olson joined us, who described this very tragic vehicle accident that he was in, and he was rushed to the hospital. He lost his wife, he lost one of his children, and Jeff O'Driscoll, who's with us today, was his doctor in that setting. And he has some interesting kind of untraditional abilities, I'll call them, and he was able to actually communicate with the wife of Jeff in that setting. And so we're going to kind of just guide along, bring you along to how Jeff got to be in this situation, and then kind of fill us in the other side of the story from what Jeff shared with us. So we're gonna welcome Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming on. And I think probably the best place to start is to go back kind of to your origin in all this. And I know you've written a beautiful book about your life that we will put up as a link.
Not Yet?
Not Yet is the title. It's a fantastic book, but I think people will hear a lot of your story. But where I'd like to start is really with your childhood and the event that kind of opened you up to this, and that very specifically would involve your older brother and what happened when you were young. If you could share that with us, and then we'll kind of expand into how all that and your life has evolved.
Sure. It was just a month before my 12th birthday when my 15-year-old brother was involved in a farm accident. He and I were very close. We did a lot of things together. He gave me my first drink of beer. He gave me my first chew of tobacco. We don't tell my mom about those things. But you can imagine an 11-year-old, I thought chewing tobacco was for what else? Chewing, right? So he gave me a lot of it, and I was on the back of the horse. We only had one horse at the time. We were riding double. I about fell off the back of the horse. And I loved my brother. I believed everything my brother said until one day he tried to tell me about sex. And I said, oh, no way. And he goes, yeah, really. And so we were really close. And as I say, I was just a month before my 12th birthday. My older brother tipped a tractor over, and he lost his life. Oh. And I still remember the agonizing cry of my mother when she found out her firstborn son had passed.
Oh, yeah.
It's seared into my mind. I can still hear it.
Hmm.
But I didn't think it really impacted me. I thought I got through it without any major psychic impact until 20 years later, my deceased brother came to me. Hmm. And he said, you have to go talk with our mother because there's things she's never told you about my death. and that kind of got my attention, you might imagine. So I went and I sat down with my mother. We had a nice long visit. And that day, for the very first time, she told me, she said, before Stan died, I always knew where you were in the house because I could hear you singing. When your brother died, you stopped singing. And that was the first time I realized that his death had had a real impact on me. But it must have, I think, as you said, Eben, that's where it all started, because I remember as a 16-year-old, just a few years after he died, I was driving a car, a Volkswagen Bug, going 60 miles an hour on a narrow, windy little road after dark. I had two friends in the car. None of us were wearing seatbelts, of course. And a voice wrapped itself around my heart and said, you need to slow down. And for some reason I listened. I went around the corner. We hit a Cadillac head on. There was a lot of damage, but nobody was injured. And I honestly think I might have died that night if he hadn't have spoken to me and I hadn't have listened. And it took me years to realize it was my brother that had spoken to me, because that's the only person I would have listened to. I wouldn't have listened to my parents or an authority figure or law enforcement. I've joked that if God had been sitting in the seat next to me, I wouldn't have listened to him either. But I would have listened to my brother. And I think that's who spoke to me that night and saved my life. And I started to have more and more of those kind of experiences as time went on.
Oh, wow. That is absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And so tell us how that kind of manifested. For one thing, I'm very interested in your selection of a career as a healer. Going into medicine to heal people, and what did this kind of awareness of a bigger reality, one in which the soul of your departed brother could actually help you to navigate this life? What did that kind of knowledge? How did that influence your decisions to go into medicine and your notions about healing?
Well, it must have happened more frequently over time. I don't remember all the experiences. I remember the car wreck, and I probably wouldn't have remembered some of the other experiences because I didn't start keeping a journal until I was 19. I've kept a daily journal for the last 40 years since I was 19. And in my journal one day, I was reading about the car crash and that voice and stuff, and I still remembered that. But there must have been a lot of others I don't remember, because one thing I do recall, when I was 19, I went to this woman that was a few years older than me, and she had a lot of life experience, and I trusted her for some reason. And using the only vocabulary that was available to me as a kid that grew up in a Christian background, without giving her any context at all for my question, I said, "Does God ever speak to you in sentences?" And she just looked at me, and she had this knowing look, and she kind of pointed her finger at me, as I recall, and she said, "Don't ever doubt that." That was all she said. And it proved to be good advice. And so over time, I started to hear things more often. And sometimes I knew who was speaking to me. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes they'd tell me who they were, usually deceased people that I was connected with in some way. But then I started to see things as well. I started to see souls that were not in their bodies anymore. And so by the time I got to the experience that Karen mentioned with Jeff Olson's wife, when I walked into the trauma room and Jeff Olson was unconscious on the gurney, I saw his deceased wife standing in the air above the gurney, and she communicated with me. And it was so common to me by that time. It was impressive. It was wonderful. It was real. But we sent Jeff Olson off to the OR, and I walked out of the trauma room, pulled off my shoe covers and my gown, and went about the rest of my shift, and never expected to see him again. And I wrote one sentence about it in my journal. So it felt natural. It felt normal. It felt part of me as I went along. But as Karen mentioned earlier, it happens a lot when people die and when they're born, because it seems to be that's when this veil, if you will, is drawn back, when somebody's arriving or when they're leaving. And there's a lot of that takes place in the emergency department. So I had a lot of experiences in the emergency department that a lot of people wouldn't have an opportunity to have.
So did you have these abilities while you were in med school, and did you share them with anyone?
Yes, I had experiences. No, I didn't share.
Yeah.
And to get back to Eben's earlier question about my decision to go to medical school, I'm afraid it was very anticlimactic, if you will. I was walking along. I was an undergrad. I was a sophomore in college. And I had a friend whose dad was a doctor, and like Eben, he'd known all his life he was going to be a doctor because his dad was a doctor, right? I didn't know that doctors' kids became doctors. And so I looked at my friend one day, and I said, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm going to be a doctor," just like everybody in the world knew already. And I remember thinking, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll try that. That was my decision to go into medicine.
Excellent. Well, you made the right choice. I think you've become quite a healer in more ways than one might have anticipated back in those early days by having these earlier experiences. But I can't help but think it must have been somewhat unusual to be going through all that medical education and training, and learning about it all when you also have this kind of knowledge through personal experience of kind of the bigger aspects of the soul and of basically the nature of humanity. And it's really amazing that you had all that as an ability as you were going through a fairly normal life, developing as a physician.
Yeah, I remember one time when I was still a resident, I walked in to see one of my patients, and she was the first person in Utah diagnosed with Addison's disease. She was quite elderly at that time, and this was quite a while ago. And she was doing fine, and she was getting ready to go home. And while I'm in the room, the only other person in the room with her was her husband. And he literally grabbed me by the arms and he pulled me into a chair. And he had this real urgency about him, like he felt some compelling need to tell me this. I talk about this in my book. He'd had an aortic aneurysm a few months before, and he was just recovering from the surgery when he nearly lost his life, and he had an out-of-body experience. And he was a Christian man, and part of his out-of-body experience was he experienced Christ during his mortal ministry. He experienced Christ at the Last Supper, and he started to tell me all of this in great detail. And I remember sitting there thinking, why are you telling me this? And it wasn't until decades later I kind of realized, oh, he was somebody I really respected, and coming from him, looking back, I thought, oh, that validates so many of my own experiences. I think that's why he felt compelled to tell me, and maybe he didn't even realize why he felt compelled to tell me.
Right.
That makes total sense. Somehow you just had this kind of, you exuded this comfort or kind of no risk at sharing that. And obviously you responded not with shock and, oh, that can't be true, but you accepted it, I imagine, yeah?
Yeah, I'd had enough experiences by then. I just accepted it. For me, it never seemed like a contradiction to the science. Mm-hmm. They seemed complementary. They seemed like they were on parallel courses, and sometimes they'd overlap a bit, but they never seemed to be contradictory. That's how I felt as a scientist in training, and the spiritual experiences I'd had. They felt complementary, not contradictory to me.
And yet somehow you knew in that setting not to talk about them. How did you figure that out? Had you just been already sharing maybe at some point and got some reactions and you learned, or did you just know instinctively, don't bring that up?
I think there was a couple of things. Sometimes it felt too sacred to talk about. And sometimes I think I was reluctant about how it might be received among colleagues and how it might impact my professional reputation. And in retrospect, I think I had a reluctance to talk about it too, out of respect for patients. Because as you might imagine, if this got out, there would be some patients in the ER that would go, oh, you're that doctor that talks with dead people. And they would be very comfortable with that. They might even like it. But there would be some patients in the middle of the night in the emergency department when I'm the only physician available, they'd look at me and they go, I remember you. I don't want you to be my doctor. Some people would be very uncomfortable with it. And I think one of the reasons I didn't talk about it is out of respect for the patients that I would be taking care of and what they might feel about it.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And I'm very curious, and I'm sure our viewers are as well. Can you describe some of the experiences, not the Jeff one, but kind of what is it like to see a soul and what do they tell you? I
came to work one day and I walked past the resuscitation room by the ambulance bay. I came in through the ambulance doors. I walked past the resuscitation room over to my workstation. And as I passed one of the resuscitation rooms, there was actually a patient in there. They were trying to resuscitate her. A doctor was giving orders. Someone was doing chest compressions. The patient was intubated. They were ventilating the patient manually. And I went over and started to log onto my computer. And as I did so, I felt this profound spiritual presence over my shoulder. And I'd had enough experience by then, I knew who it was. And she asked me for help. And I remember thinking, wow, why are you asking me for help? But I stopped what I was doing. I walked around the corner and back into the care room where they were working on this patient. Nobody paid any attention to me because I was in my work clothes. I was coming to work. I was just a doctor there. So I was inconspicuous in the room, but there was an empty spot on along one part of the gurney where there wasn't somebody crowded. And I just walked over and I rested my hand on her leg because I had learned by then how important touch can be in these experiences. And as I touched her, she communicated with me again, and she asked me if she could leave. Now, mind you, this is all telepathically. She's unconscious. She's having resuscitation. She's getting chest compressions. And I thought, why are you asking me? But something came to me from some profound place, and I understood. And I said back to her, telepathically, if you will, I said, if you feel it's the right time to go and you think that's the right thing to do, I think it's probably all right for you to go. And as I said that, she rose up out of her body and she stood in the air above the gurney. And you ask, what is it like to see it? It's like you're seeing with your physical eyes, but if it was my physical eyes, everybody else in the room would have seen it as well. You see it somehow differently. And the way I think about it from a scientific perspective is, light comes to us in electromagnetic waves in various wavelengths and frequencies, and it gets focused on our retina, and the rods and cones turn it into electrical signals that travel down our optic nerve. Eben could tell you this a lot better than me. They cross at the chiasm, they go to the contralateral occipital cortex, and there they get interpreted into an image that you see. And when I see spiritually, it's like all of those other steps are bypassed and I just get the image. Mm-hmm. And it's just as real, it's almost tangible. And it's not like the person is translucent. It's not like I can see through them, but I can see what's on the other side of them at the same time I'm seeing them. Mm-hmm. And I can see in all directions at the same time. It's completely independent of my physical organs. And she appeared to be about half the age of the body she'd just come out of. She seemed to be in the very prime of her existence, if you will. She was profoundly happy and filled with love and gratitude. And she filled me with light and glory. And she thanked me for what I had done, which seemed to me to be nothing. And then she left. And I turned around and I started to walk out of the room. And as I got near the door, the doctor that was running the code in military time pronounced her death. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, yeah, I know, I saw her leave. Wow. And I went out and logged onto the computer, and that's how my shift started that day.
Wow. It must have been an incredible experience to go through life, especially trained as a scientist and trained in medical science, and yet experiencing these things on a regular basis. And I would think it would certainly kind of flavor the kind of discussion you would have with patients about about mortality and
terminal illness.
Yeah, terminal illness not really being the end of conscious awareness. You have to be very cautious about how you approach that with various patients, or I guess a lot depends on what they're ready for.
Yeah, you have to keep your own biases, your own religious traditions. You have to step out of that, and you have to be respectful of the patient's value system and religious background and things. I remember one time an experience very similar to the one with Jeff Olson, where a person had been killed in a car crash, and one of their family members was brought to my emergency department, and the parents of the family member were there in the room with them. Mm. And when I went in, I had an experience, and I understood that the deceased person was there too, but I was expressly impressed not to say anything about it, not to bring it up, not to tell the parents, nothing. And I let it go, because that was the impression that I got, was that one wasn't for talking about, at least not then.
Wow. And yet, in many ways that's so sad, because this is kind of a profound, liberating, refreshing truth about the ongoing existence of relationships and souls, beyond the death of the physical body. And yet in our culture, tragically, you have to be cautious about sharing that kind of news. People can take it the wrong way.
I'm just, picturing this ideal world where doctors like yourself know these things. And it's kind of the antithesis of, when you said, yes, it's okay to go to that soul. It's the antithesis of what doctors are taught, to bring people back to life. And so very often I think doctors have to learn how to deal with that death and kind of develop sort of a neutrality about it, or whatever it is. But you have this understanding, a more rich understanding that
Statistic
death
I
is not
heard,
the end.
Yeah, a statistic I heard a while back, and I don't know whether this is still accurate or not, but there was only about 5% of medical schools that had a mandatory course in death and dying. Talk about denial.
Right. Yeah, that's really bad.
Because death is a failure, right? In their minds, generally speaking.
For a lot of people, that's the way they view it, particularly in the medical profession. And yet, we can help people without bringing up anything about some of these spiritual experiences. I had a patient come in one time. He was in a wheelchair, and he had ALS, advanced ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And he had just been in the Veterans Hospital a week or two before with pneumonia. And it felt like it was coming back. And the thing he hated most about any medical interaction he'd had with the medical system was he hated having his airway suctioned. And as Eben can attest, you know, when you have ALS, you have an increasing inability to clear your own secretions from your airway. And so you get pneumonia. And nobody had had this conversation with this guy. I sat down with him and I said, listen, I can admit you to the hospital. I can treat your pneumonia. It will go away. And in a few weeks, it'll probably come back. And when he understood the natural course of his illness, he was able to weigh the things that he wanted and the things that he didn't want, and he was able to make a decision. And he was so profoundly grateful for somebody that was actually willing to sit and talk with him about the natural course of his illness, which included physical death. And he was perfectly comfortable declining to be admitted to the hospital and not having his airway suctioned in the future. And it was very helpful for him to have somebody willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's why I think this kind of bigger picture that you bring to the table is one that we can share with many physicians as we move forward with this understanding. And I think that's part of what you have in mind for a course coming up, I guess, next year, if COVID allows. But if you could share with us a bit of how you see kind of bringing the medical profession up to speed on this and how we can really help do that. I want to contribute as best I can to that whole effort. What do you think of what's the reality of looking at waking up the medical profession to this?
Reality of the soul, basically.
Well, as you know, many people have had near-death experiences. With catastrophic trauma, the numbers in the 5 to 10% range. Some statistics say that number goes as high as 20% in cardiac arrest survivors that have had cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So it's a very common phenomenon, despite what much of the society thinks. And some studies have indicated that the person that the patient would most like to talk about their experience with is their physician. And similarly, it's been studied, most physicians are not comfortable talking about it. They don't want to talk about it.
Right.
So the conference you mentioned that I'm putting together is not about convincing physicians that there's an afterlife or that they have to believe anything in particular. The purpose of it is to look at near-death experiences both from a medical perspective, but also from the perspective of, if you're not comfortable talking about it, just be professional enough not to diminish it and degrade it and denigrate it to your patient, and refer them instead to somebody that has experience that can talk with them about it. Because as you know, Eben, it's very traumatic for a patient to talk with their physician and be demeaned or ridiculed. And most of them will wait several years before they'll even talk about the experience that was so profound and life-changing for them.
Well, that's absolutely true. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book Proof of Heaven, was I knew that it could influence the medical profession by pointing out the scientific evidence that consciousness is not necessarily dependent on a living body and a living brain, but that it's a much bigger concept than that. And I knew that by taking the lid off and allowing the medical profession, doctors, nurses, and all kinds of healthcare workers to share these stories would then allow the people who have them to talk more robustly about them and share. And I think that's really what, from my point of view, has changed this world a lot in the last decade or so, is there's been a kind of a radical opening up of the world at large, and I believe also in the scientific and medical professions to more about near-death experiences as we get into this as a scientific discussion of the nature of consciousness. And from my point of view, it's not really about religion at all, as much as about how the science of consciousness and the mind-brain relationship is really leading us to this notion of the fundamental existence of consciousness. And it's really a shared form of consciousness, as most near-death experiencers will tell you. And in fact, that shared form even includes the ability to see a oneness with God as being a form of conscious expression in human beings.
Right.
And this is where I believe this bigger discussion of the scientific nature of consciousness and of these kind of experiences, certainly including your lifelong experiences, really kind of opens the door to this discussion for the world at large.
And one of my most profound experiences didn't have at all to do with somebody dying, interestingly enough. It happened in the emergency department, but it didn't have to do with somebody dying. And I never spoke about this until our mutual friend, Jeff Olson, persuaded me that I should share it because it was meaningful. I walked into a room one day. It was about this time of year. It was in November, as I recall, and it was snowy on the ground. It was wet and cold. And the only other person in the room was this homeless person, the patient. He had this long unkept hair and an unkept stringy beard. He had tattered, soiled clothing. He had holes in his shoes and holes in his socks, and I could see portions of his feet through the holes. He struggled with addictions. He was the antithesis of everything the world defines as success. I filled a wash basin full of warm water, and I put some soap in it, and I grabbed a wash rag, and I sat down at the foot of the gurney. I took off his shoes, and I removed the last threads of his socks, and I lowered his feet into the water, and I washed his feet.
Oh, wow.
And in the process of washing his feet, everything that was mortal, everything that was physical or temporal was drawn back, and I saw who he was. I saw his divine nature. And I said it at the time, and I still feel it. I was in the presence of God.
Wow.
This person that I went into the room, I thought I was going in to serve him, and I realized as I left that he was there ministering to me, because I realized from that day forward that every soul I looked at was God.
Oh,
That's who we all are. And we're always next to God, whether we're sitting in church or in the gutter. And that experience, seeing that person's divine, eternal nature, changed me, and it changed the way I view every soul since.
That is beautiful.
It really is.
It kind of rings true with everything I've come to know in the 12 years since my coma experience about the oneness of consciousness and how we are truly all in this together. It's a shared journey, and that binding force of love that is so obvious to near-death experiencers. I mean, that's what they bring back to this world as an assurance that there's nothing to fear about death of the physical body and leaving this physical plane. And yet you have put it so beautifully. That oneness is something that is right there in the very core of every little breath we take, and every moment, every interaction we have with others is a mode of knowing that deep connection and that God sense that's right at the core of our very conscious awareness. That is a beautiful story.
I fully agree. I grew up in a Christian tradition, but I have a broad theological construct and a spiritual perspective. I've studied the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita. I learned Hebrew to study the Torah so I could understand the Torah better. I tried learning Greek. I didn't get very far in Greek. I didn't even try Arabic. I just studied the Quran in English.
And there's Assyrian. That's another one for you.
Right.
So I have very, very broad views, very accepting views. But one of the things I think that Christ said that is the most profound, and people just brush right past it, was, he said, "I am the light of the world." But just shortly after that, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's speaking to a big group of people on the Mount, and he said, "You are the light."
Mm-hmm.
Righto. It's really
More
interesting how
profound
you,
truth than that. You are the light.
yeah, and it's so interesting how from your experiences that you've shared, you've learned probably the exact same lessons that many near-death experiencers bring back. I was especially struck not only by, touching God and feeling all of that, but the way you described seeing the soul rise up out of the body was so similar to how Eben and others describe what it's like to be in that near-death experience. So it's almost like you're in your physical body, but somehow your soul is able to interact soul to soul with these folks. I wonder if they see you as well. Have you ever heard anyone say they saw your soul?
Well, they've communicated with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's as if you become one. You've heard near-death experiences describe that. I've had that experience. I've become one with another soul on more than one occasion. I've had a life review. And interestingly enough, although Eben can tell you all the proposed mechanisms for NDEs, Bruce Grayson wrote a great book chapter where he went through them each, neurotransmitter dumping, temporal lobe seizures, anoxic brain, the whole bit. Nobody makes any attempt at all to explain what happened to me.
Right.
It was in the middle of a shift. I was perfectly healthy on no medications. I wasn't ill. I didn't have trauma. I walked out of the trauma room after experiencing Jeff Olson's deceased wife, and I finished my shift and went home. And nobody even attempts to propose an explanation for what happened to me.
Well, we know the explanation. It's because consciousness is fundamental, and that's how it works. But I'm very curious. You brought up Jeff's wife again, and you briefly told us what happened, but can you tell us a little more, because people know Jeff's story, and could you tell us what his wife told you, or something about that would kind of fill in some gaps, or even stuff that happened, whatever you think would be useful?
She communicated to me the same thing that many of these souls have communicated to me. It was profound love and gratitude. It was ineffable oneness. And the thing was a month later, when Jeff had a bunch of surgeries, his leg had been amputated, he was awake, he could talk. I communicated with him in his hospital room a month after this. And when he heard this, he started to weep because he knew it was her. Just from hearing the description of what happened, he knew it was her. And that was when he told me that before his body had even been extricated from the vehicle, he'd left his body and he'd had an encounter with her. And she said, "You have to go back and raise our other son." And so he and I shared these independent, profound experiences with his wife that day, about a month after his accident. And we've been fast friends since. It's 23 years later. And we've shared many experiences. In fact, Tamara has come to me a number of times, interestingly. I never met her in life, but a few years ago, Jeff Olson was moving out of state. He was moving to Arizona, and I thought, well, we won't see each other much anymore. Our friendship will probably kind of drift apart a bit. And in the midst of thinking that, his deceased wife, Tamara, came to me 20 years after the fact and said, "Don't let anything come between your friendship with Jeff."
Oh, that is absolutely beautiful.
So this really validates, because so many people ask us, do souls on the other side are they still aware of what's going on here? Clearly, in your experience, they are totally aware. Maybe not all of them, but certainly those that still have attachments to souls here on earth, they're still around, it seems.
Let me give you a more dramatic example. More than 40 years after my brother's death, just a few years ago, I was in meditation and he came to me and he took me by the hand. And when he touched my hand, the walls and the ceiling of the building I was in faded away. And he led me through this profoundly glorious place that I think most people would call heaven. And he gave me a portion of a life review. He showed me the days in my life where my course had changed direction dramatically. And then he showed me that it was him that had intervened on my behalf on those days.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
Then he showed me the day of his death, and I'd always viewed it from that of a 12-year-old boy. But he showed it to me from the perspective of my parents. And I had all the pain, the agony, the sorrow, the grief that my parents had experienced. I experienced it. I saw it from their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized for the first time, my biggest wound from my brother's death wasn't being separated from him. It was seeing the agony of my parents and not being able to do anything about it.
Oh, wow.
And then my brother looked at me and he said, "Go tell our parents not to be sad anymore.
Mm.
I'm okay. And I want them to smile when they talk about me."
Wow.
That was more than 40 years after he died. Yeah, that's how aware they are.
Did you have that conversation with your parents?
I did. It took me a few weeks.
Do they understand that you still have a connection to him?
Yeah, when they read my book, they said, "How come we didn't know these things?"
Good.
But they understand now. And so, yeah, it took me a few weeks to work up the courage to go have the conversation with them. But when I had the conversation, I was given to understand why I was sent with that message. I never knew these things until that day. When my brother approached my father that summer, at the beginning of the summer, he said, "Dad, I want a new pair of cowboy boots." And he picked them out. They were $125, which was a lot of money. My father said, "I can't afford those." And my brother said, "It's okay. I got a job on the other side of the county." And he was working on somebody else's ranch when he had his accident. He wasn't at home.
Mm.
And so the day he died, the ecclesiastical leader in our community drove the 20 miles to where my father worked, and my father was at lunch. He went into his office and sat down and waited for my father to come back from lunch. You can imagine the feeling in my father's heart when he walked into the room and saw this man sitting in his office. And he looked up at my father and he said, "There's been an accident. Stan's hurt." And my father said, "How bad is it?" The man said, "He's dead." And my father said, "My son's dead for a pair of cowboy boots." That's why my brother came back more than 40 years later and told me to go tell my parents not to be sad anymore. I had no idea my father had been carrying that guilt ever since.
Wow.
And they are aware. They know.
Yeah.
They know how to help us if we let them.
How fortunate that you had that aspect of what a life review is, feeling the feelings from the perspective of others. Amazing that you had that, but you haven't died. I mean, I think we all would like to have that kind of connection, right? So we could know these things.
Yeah, see, this was part of, interestingly, a particular television show approached Jeff Oltz, and a couple different ones wanted him to be on, and they wanted me to come on. And I was really reluctant. This is when I was still seeing patients. Mm-hmm. And they wanted somebody to come and attest to the medical severity of Jeff's injuries and his death and these other things. And I looked at Jeff and I said, if that's their focus, they've already missed the boat.
Yeah.
Very good.
They don't understand. If they think it's about proving somebody's dead enough to classify them as dead, that's not the point.
No,
I didn't die. I know what these experiences are. You don't have to die. What it's about is becoming aware. That's why in my book, that's why the subtitle of my book talks about near life experiences, because people come back from the other side and they say, that was life. That was real. I was closer to life in that experience than any time I've been in my mortal experience. They're near life experiences, not near death experiences for me.
Absolutely. Well, I love that you use that in your title. And, you know, it's interesting whenever I encounter someone like you who clearly has, you know, a very facile relationship with kind of spiritual realms. I kind of wonder about what might have set the stage for that early on. And for example, sometimes I'll find out that maybe they had a near-death experience as an infant or something like that, something to thin the veil. Is there anything in your history when you look back on this?
Besides the trauma of your brother's death.
Besides that particular trauma, is there anything in your early life that you think might explain why you would have this very ready and facile ability to sense of the spiritual realms?
Not that I'm aware of. I know I had some regular kind of falls. You know, I fell off the roof onto concrete when I was like 5, I think. I don't know if he even got knocked out, but I know I had stitches, and I've had a few things like that. But I've never asked my mom, "Hey, did I die when I was a kid?" But I've had somebody else suggest that same thing to me, Eben. I don't know what the impact of my brother's death had on me, whether that was the only thing or there was something more. But if there is something more, if I did have something that was close to a near-death experience, I'm not aware of it at this point in time. But part of, I think, what made it comfortable for me was, even since I was a little kid, I somehow knew that I've always existed. That my sojourn in the flesh was just part of some divine, eternal journey. And so I was perfectly comfortable with the notion that people come into this life through birth and they go through death, and it's just a transition. It's not an end. And I've always had that perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I've had just as profoundly spiritual experiences in the ER when people are born as when they die. It's like I'm standing next to this veil, if you will, this curtain, and it's drawn back to allow somebody to either arrive or to leave. And if you're close enough, some of that glory and light from the other side gets to splash onto you, and you experience some of it with them for a time. And if it's drawn back far enough and held open long enough, you might look inside. You might even see somebody you recognize. That's the metaphor that I like to use.
Wow. Very, very beautiful. Well, yeah, I think it's clear that you have a very thin veil. And, you know, a lot of people who have near-death experiences come away from that experience with some thinning of the veil. I know that my own kind of sense of intuition, of kind of empathy with others was radically altered for the better after my NDE. And I think a lot of that just has to do with, once you've experienced that oneness of mind and consciousness, as you've described so beautifully in several of your experiences, I think you just begin to realize that we're all really sharing that one mind. And in many ways, that's what brings kind of the sacred and divine into our very presence and awareness. And of course, it's such a gift to come into that in this life and be able to, you know, share the love that shows us. Because really the best, most profound effect of a life review, I think, is to show people that we are all really part of that one mind. We're sharing the dream of the one mind, that God force of understanding. And it's something that you seem to have naturally acquired at a young age. It's, you know, from my point of view, it simply is a litmus test for like an older soul. And that, of course, brings up the whole issue of, as you mentioned minutes ago, of the sense of having always existed. Do you also have a sense of some specific details of past lives and a sense of how that might have contributed to your current life?
I haven't had the sense of past lives. I don't begrudge anybody having that experience or feeling that they've had that experience. The way I feel about it is I just have felt like I've received what I needed to receive in this existence, and I didn't need to have another existence like this on Earth before or in the future. That's kind of the way I feel now. Now, I may feel differently at some point in time, but I've never had a sense of a past life, and I've never felt a need for one somehow. But I love what you say about helping people come to this recognition of who we are and feeling that love, that unity, that empathy. And that's one of the things I work with my clients about, because now with COVID, of course, I use Zoom a lot. I have clients on 5 continents and about 10 different countries around the world. And you'd be amazed how many of them come to me and they think they've never had a spiritual experience. And what I do is I help them walk through something that was profound for them that they didn't recognize was spiritual. I mean, for some people, it might be the sensations they had standing on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. For others, it might be sitting in an opera, in a Scala, right? People have had profound experiences where they get a tingling, they get goosebumps, they get a chill up their spine. And what I do is I help people realize that that is spirit. That is an experience. And you can, in your mind, in meditation or otherwise, and sometimes literally physically, you can go to that place again or that time, and you can open yourself up to have more spirit. I used to think when it first started that I had no control of any kind over it, that it just spontaneously happened to me. And then I learned that I may not control it, but I can make myself more open to it. I can make myself more receptive to it when it comes. And in that way, I can experience it more completely and more frequently.
So you mentioned that you've been keeping a journal since you were 19, and that is pretty remarkable in and of itself. But I know you've shared with us how that journal has come in very handy sometimes, because I know that sometimes, and you've kind of alluded to that, things will happen, you'll write them down, and they don't become significant until much, much later. Can you share, because I think people should do this more often for this very reason, and maybe you can share one of those examples.
Yeah. When I wrote my book a few years ago, it has some experiences from my childhood and some from later in my life, but most of it's focused on that first year I met Jeff Olson and the experiences that we shared together. And I referenced my journal a few times when I was looking at that. And it was interesting because when I read through my journal about that time period, I remember reading things and going, oh, I'd forgotten that. I can't believe that happened. There were things I did not put in my book because I thought, if I put that in here, nobody will believe it. They'll discard, they'll discredit the whole book because they won't believe. And so there were things I left out because it was a very rich, fertile time for spiritual experiences somehow, that part of my life. But just a couple of years ago, for the first time ever, I read my whole journal. And the thing that kept coming up that I noticed was I was always beating up on myself. I was always, oh, I ate too much. I slept in too late. I didn't exercise enough. I did this. I didn't do that. And when I read back at it, read it and saw it in that concentrated form, reading the whole thing, I remember stopping and thinking, gee, Jeff, give yourself a break. Take a breath. Live a little, you know? And it really helped me to embrace Eckhart Tolle more fully, you know, to live in the now, to accept myself as I am right this minute. I'm good enough right now. I am enough. I am loved. I am divine. And I don't have to be anything more or anything different than I am right now.
So you're describing kind of the human condition. And so even though you're having these amazing spiritual experience and feeling the oneness, you still have that kind of feeling as you go throughout your day. So that's good to remind people too. You shift, but everything doesn't quite change. You don't suddenly become, a light body or something,
I never thought of myself as a healer when I was working in the emergency department. Never crossed my mind. I'm a doctor, I help people with their physical ailments. That's what I thought of. And then when I stopped seeing patients in the ER, the very first speaking engagement I was going to, I'd written my book. Within a few months, I'd written my book. It was published. I was going to my first formal speaking engagement, and I was sitting in the airport with a stack of books, and this young couple came up to me in the lounge area, asked me the usual airport questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? And when they got to the topic of what I was speaking about, the woman looked at me with this really sincere look, and she said, my grandfather just died, and he's come to me a couple of times. And initially I thought, why would this woman share something so intimate with a complete stranger? And then I realized, oh, I'm a safe place. Mm-hmm. She knows I'll believe her. And she took one of my books and went and caught her plane. I'd been an emergency physician for 25 years at that point. I estimated I'd seen in excess of 60,000 patients. I got on my plane, and on the way to Boston, that voice that speaks to my heart spoke to me and said, you will help more people with this book than you helped as a physician in the emergency department. And it changed my whole perspective about what the next chapter of my life is about. Mm-hmm. And I was talking with a friend about it one day, and he looked at me and he goes, I think you're a healer. Mm-hmm. I said, oh, no. I said, because as I told you, I grew up in a Christian tradition that runs deep in me, even though I have a broad perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think of Christ as the great healer, right? And I said, no, there's only one healer. And he looked at me and he said, I think you're a healer, and I think you should ask for permission to use the word. So I came home, I changed my clothes. I did a running meditation that day. I get good downloads when I'm out on a run. And as I'm out running, I said, is it okay to call myself a healer? And Christ came to me and he chuckled and he said,
just like I'm chuckling because it's so obvious to us.
Of course.
he kind of laughed and he said, I made you a healer.
Beautiful.
And when he said that, when he said, I made you a healer, I got this download and I understood, oh, he's not diminished by my successes. If I'm a really good healer, it doesn't make him less.
No.
And I got this clear understanding, and I came home and I had a broadened understanding of what the rest of my life's about.
Absolutely. Wow. That is beautiful. As you said earlier, you know, there are those biblical quotes of Christ saying, and these things and greater you will do. You know, the answer lies within us all. He was basically trying to show that connection to God that we all have and share, and not trying to make himself special in that respect. And yet it just reminds me that healing comes from the same word as wholeness. And I believe all of us came to this world to become more whole, more of the soul that we came here to be, you know, and this is part of learning and teaching and growing and transformation and the evolution of consciousness. I think you delivered a beautiful set of stories that help us to realize how much of a healer you've come to recognize yourself to be. It was always there from the beginning. And the fact that you're sharing it widely is truly bringing healing to the world. So I'd like to personally thank you for that. You're doing a beautiful job bringing this healing to the world. And I think that your story is amazing. I would encourage any of our audience out there to pick up the book, you know, Not Yet. And also if they have a chance to see you present, and I know Karen and I both seen you and Jeff together. And
also you have a mentoring practice now where people can learn about at the website, jeffodriscoll.com or helpingsoulsheal.com. They both go to the same place. I've popped them in the chat screen. So yeah, you can find out how to get in touch with him directly. Dr. Jeff, it says.
I was talking with Raymond Moody once about my book, and he told me something I found amazing. He said that he had been studying near-death experiences for 40 years. He'd written books, of course, spoken all over the world, but he still harbored this reluctance to admit that there was an afterlife. He was not convinced that there was an afterlife. And he told me personally that when he heard about my experience with Jeff Olson's wife, and when he read my book, it finally put him over the edge and he conceded, yes, there is an afterlife and I believe in it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
He says, I give up.
Yeah, he told us the same thing about your story. In fact, I remember Raymond's excitement when he saw us at a meeting and he said, you won't believe what has happened. And of course, we knew Jeff's story, but then when you entered the story as you know, the physician involved in his care, who also encountered Tamara's soul in the ER, that really sent him over the edge. And I think Raymond was he was so grateful to you for sharing that, because for him personally, I think that was a very important catalyst to help in his growth. So
thank you for writing that book.
Yeah, thank you for going public with this too.
Very brave.
I know as a physician, it's not an easy thing to do, to share this kind of deeply personal, profound, spiritual, personal experience. But it's absolutely necessary for this world to grow into the world it came here to be. So I would like to personally thank you, you know, as a fellow physician, for your brave and courageous sharing of your story, and also helping other people with your life coaching, with your books, your presentations. I think it's really a gift to this world.
And myself as a patient, because from the patient perspective, what a blessing to have a doctor who has that holistic view. We hear about holistic doctors, and that just generally means, oh, they tell you to exercise and, you know, meditate. But you actually have this soul-to-soul understanding that really our world is in desperate need of. So I have a feeling your story is just beginning.
Right. I think it's
Yeah.
going to really explode on this world and help this world a lot.
Especially if you arrange that medical conference where instead of, the woo-woo folks showing up, it's actually medical doctors who begin to take this kind of phenomena a little more seriously. So thank you for that bridge building.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been an honor. I know you guys want to do a meditation. I don't want to keep you from it, but really wonderful to visit with you both. Namaste.
Well, namaste to you too. And thanks again, Jeff, so much for coming on. We've seen a lot of positive comments coming through here, and I think you will help a tremendous number of people with your work. So,
and we would have seen you, I think, a couple times this year, at least at Helping Parents Heal in the spring. And now it all got canceled, but now we got to see you here.
Yeah, so
and heal you.
We would have seen each other in my hometown in Salt Lake, because Ions was going to be in Salt Lake.
Except we weren't going. Except we weren't going to be
this year
there.
we're going to take a pass on it, but COVID made us take a pass anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
But hopefully we'll see you soon. We would love to reconnect again. I think this news about the vaccine progress is very promising to me. It's kind of surprising as a physician. But
let me ask you this, because we do have a minute. What are your thoughts on the whole COVID thing from this higher perspective?
The bigger
what we're going
picture.
through globally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that I don't think that COVID is some divinely appointed plague for good or bad. I think it's simply a virus, it's an illness, but how we receive it and how we respond to it has the value to make us so much better as a society, to bring us together, to make us one, to care about somebody else more than you care about yourself, to wear a mask. Eben can comment on this as a surgeon. I wore a mask a lot as a physician for 25 years. I never once wore it for the protection of myself. I was wearing it for the protection of the people I was taking care of. And never once did any of them complain about me making a political statement by wearing a mask.
Yeah, we're aligned completely.
Totally agree
with everything
with that.
You just said. The opportunity to respond and to help each other, we feel is an opportunity that we have. So
right.
Just like any kind of hardship. So yeah, we do want to move on, and thank you again so much, Jeff, for joining us. And I'll send you the chat screen so you can see all these beautiful comments people are leaving and stories. They're telling stories. So really awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for being on, Jeff, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Okay, everybody. Now is the time for us to do our meditation where we, because we're now so physically separate, this is a way for us to connect spiritually on that spiritual level, which is that unseen part of us, soul to soul, as Jeff was so eloquently sharing with us. This kind of connection, I believe, is happening all the time, but we're just not aware of it. So I love how Jeff was saying, you've probably already had a spiritual experience. You just have to pay attention, acknowledge it, and believe that that's what it is. So this is an opportunity now to sort of feel that connection with all your fellow souls on earth, that one soul we're all a part of. So I invite you now to bring your attention to this moment, here and now, calm and relaxed. Become aware of your breath as it moves in and out. Now, move your awareness to your heart center and generate a feeling of gratitude, trust, and allowing. Now, imagine your breath is moving in and out of your heart. As you exhale, imagine your breath is filling up a bubble surrounding your entire body. As you inhale, imagine your breath is coming from all points of this bubble into your heart. Continue breathing this way. filling up your bubble. Now, from your heart center, move your awareness to below your body, down, down, all the way into the center of the earth. Feel your strong and stable connection to the earth. As you continue to breathe, imagine your exhale is filling up the entire earth. Imagine your inhale is coming back to you from all points of the earth. Continue breathing this way. Now, move your awareness from the center of the earth back into your body and into the heart. Using your breath, feel your heart expand to encompass all souls in your surrounding area, all souls in your entire town, all souls in your entire country, all souls from around the globe, all souls in challenging situations, no soul left behind. Feel your heart expand to encompass the united souls of earth and beyond. Now, return from your experience and remember who you truly are, a spiritual being living a spiritual purpose. Remember,
you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are taken care of.
You are taken care of. We are all in this together, and now we can feel it. And so we invite you to do this exercise. Imagine your breath is moving in and out of your heart, expanding around your body. And this is how you can really feel your energy expand. And as we do this, the heart naturally influences those around us with whatever is inside our heart. So all of us who can feel that gratitude and it radiate it out to the world, to all those people who are in need. And some of you may recall that we like to remind people to do this each day, and no matter what time zone you're in, at 11 a.m. 11 a.m. love. And so all of you who are feeling strong and stable, feel that gratitude and radiate it to the world. And those of you who may be having a bad day or feeling less than strong and stable, receive that love. And this is that wave of love that we can all tap into at any time.
So thank you all for joining us. And of course, thanks to Dr. Jeff. What a wonderful guest. And we look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. We will be back.
No, actually, in 2 weeks, here in the United States is the Thanksgiving holiday. And so we're going to take that day off. And so we will be joining you again in 3 weeks.
3 weeks from today.
On Thursday, December 3rd, which also happens to be my birthday. So we're going to have a birthday webinar on December 3rd. And all of those of you who can join us live, it will be very fun to have you. And we're in the process of lining up that guest now, but it should be a wonderful way to spend my birthday with all of you. So thank you so much.
And I would encourage any of you who are new to this this program to also look at some of our past
especially
episodes.
August 20th with Jeff Olson.
August 20th is very important.
That'll
because it
connect
goes
some
with this one
dots for
today.
you.
But we've had many wonderful guests, and please do avail yourselves of those viewings. So,
and we love seeing all your beautiful gratitude in the chat screen. Thank you so much.
And where you're from. So thank you all. See you in 3 weeks.
Namaste.